revolution, Algeria witnessed hundreds, if not thousands, of potentially revolutionary acts of protests, ranging from mass demonstrations, instances of police brutality, self-immolations, road blockades, sports riots, citizen committee protests for access to water or electricity, unemployed youth protests, university strikes, high school protests, etc., all happening within 20 months. So contrary to, for instance, the Tunisian or Libyan cases where Ben Ali and Gaddafi created a strong impression that their countries were an island of calm and stability, unrest has been a constant feature of Algerian politics since the end of the civil war, and maybe even before, and it is therefore particularly difficult for citizens to realize that something exceptional is happening in their country when a potentially revolutionary incident occurs. And in particular, I would like to argue that the absence of a sense of exceptionality in Algeria was nourished by three factors. The first one is police violence, or the absence of police violence. The second one is the non-involvement of intermediate actors. And the second one is the routine character of local media coverage during the CNCD incidents or demonstrations that happened in the country in early 2011. So without a strong signal of exceptionality, which could have been created by the three previous factors, the events that happened in January 2011 in Algeria were perceived as just one of the many incidents that have been punctuating the country's political life in the last 2 decades. Now let's talk about each factor more in detail. And let's start with the lack, the sort of the relative restraint by state forces during the first months of 2011. So as seen in other cases, notably Tunisia, Libya, and Syria, indiscriminate police violence has an important signaling effect that gives a strong boost to informational cascades. Arrests, assassinations, instances of torture, for instance, are extremely visible signals that signal clearly to the population that a political conflict is happening in the country, while forcing the families and friends of those victims of state violence to engage in contentious politics. That's something that Taro talked about extensively, Opengern, Kurzman, and others, really. So we all know, for instance, that even when examining the case of Syria, for instance, right, it's very clear today that the first act of mass repression that was perpetrated by the Syrian regime in early 2011 when the regime arrested those kids from Dera and tortured them to death had a very, very important signaling effect locally. It showed how brutal the regime was. And it also forced the families of those people who were tortured to engage in contentious politics. So the same thing happened in Tunisia, right? When the regime started attacking people in the Sidi Bouzid, Kasserine, and Gaza Triangle, their families, their cousins and brothers who were working on the capitals heard the news of their cousins and brothers and sisters being shot and arrested by the police, and then started mobilizing in Tunisia, even though nothing happened there, right? So they started burning tires and sort of created the informational cascade locally. Now, in the Algerian case, the authorities were actually very careful not to engage in the unnecessary killing of innocent civilians, which meant, in practice, that the government was able to avoid the famous repressive paradox that Taro talks about, which could have produced a radicalization of collective action and a more effective organization of opponents. So, thus, during the protest of early 2011, even though the regime mobilized an impressive number of policemen, the regime, I think, in Algeria mobilized up to 30,000 people to control, to sort of, frame, to contain, a maximum of 5,000 protesters. Well, despite their impressive numbers, Algerian policemen had explicit instructions not to use violence against the population. For instance, in order to ensure that no member of the police would act impulsively and start, beating the population, beating citizens or shooting citizens in a moment of anger, policemen were actually searched as they were leaving the commissariat or the police stations before their shift to make sure that they were not carrying lethal weapons. So the regime was very, very aware of the potentially revolutionary consequences of strong repression. Now, the second factor that also contributed to the absence of mobilization in Algeria is the lack or the absence of involvement from respected local intermediate actors. Now, contrary to the Tunisian case, and to a lesser extent the Libyan cases, the Tunisian and Libyan cases where the involvement of respected local personalities or groups like the Bar Association, the National Unions, etc., sent a clear message to the population about the presence of a historical opportunity for contestation, the Algerian counterparts actually remained stubbornly silent during the riots of January 2011 and the subsequent demonstrations that were organized in the following weeks. So the country's main workers' association, the famous UPAS, the powerful Veterans Association that have millions of members, the Students Association, the Bar Association, the Women's Association, all those remained silent during the January 2011 protests and refused to encourage the incidents that were occurring all over the country. So while these associations and personalities could have used their prestige, or sometimes just a mere membership, to increase the dimension of the January 2011 protest, they actually chose to defend the status quo. And I'll be very happy to talk about the reasons why they decided to stick with the regime. It has to do with the complex legacy of the Civil War. It has to do with the fact that in Algeria, post-Civil War, those elites reached economic balance equilibrium in regards to state rent, and I'll be very happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But really, what happens here in terms of signaling mechanism during the early days of social mobilization was the fact that people who could have nourished mobilization when it was still very fragile actually refused to do so for reasons that were their own.
Now, the transitioning period in Yemen was probably a little bit different from countries like Tunisia or Egypt, not to mention like Syria or Bahrain, in the sense that Yemen was the only really negotiated transition that we had seen in the Arab world. And it happened at the end of 2011 when a deal or a so-called initiative that was brokered by the particularly the control over a few big companies inside Yemen, but particularly the income or the revenues coming out of the oil exploitation in the country. Now, oil started to run out around a time that was aggravated by the drop of the oil prices later in the 2000s, and the fact that he wanted to groom his son to become the next president, similar as what was happening in Egypt at the time as well. At the same time, so he was reducing the access to those resources more and more to his own family, to his son and to his nephews, who were basically controlling the different functions of the military. At the same time, there was a generational shift taking place in the elite. Now, Yemen is a very young country. About like 65% of the population are under the age of 30. So a generational shift had been taking place in the population already, and it was taking place also in the elite level. The old man, so to speak, who had built their patronage networks all across the country, through which they were basically fostering their loyalties and their control over the country, sort of expanded because their own sons created their own networks. They were needed basically more and more resources to fund them, to support them, in order to ensure loyalties of different local groups in the country and different tribes. And this generational shift within the elite aggravated the tensions that had been built up, because the reduction of the access to resources to the president's family alienated quite significant elite players, particularly elite in private family as well as a number of army generals. And over the course of the 2000s, covered up by a number of local wars, were already clashes between elite factions and their armed militias, or troops loyal to them.
So, in this presentation, I will demonstrate on the one hand how the strategy, the mobilization strategy of the movement and the dismantling strategy of the rulers have contributed to the exhaustion of the February 20th movement. And on the other hand, I will explain how the democratic struggles are being re-sectorized since the summer 2012 by the young activists. So to begin, it is to be said that the February 20th movement constituted itself as a decentralized social movement made up of autonomous local coordinations which is devoid of direction, leaders, or spokespersons. In other words, not only the framing process is not exclusive to the center, which is the founders of the movement, but it is also subjected to power relationships within each and every local coordination and general assembly, as it was explained to me by the interviewed activists. So this social movement brings together heterogeneous actors with very distinct ideologies. And as two researchers write, it is Benani, Shraili, and Jalali, they realized a field survey in the local coordination of Casablanca. So they write that the movement is challenged to mute the animosity between these various actors to mobilize the citizens. But the heterogeneity of the ideology within the movement has resulted finally, in a sense, to impose individual frames of the actors in competition and putting this way the common framework of democracy in danger. And as it is written by the researcher Deru, while heterogeneity is common in social movements, it becomes a very serious problem when there is ideological heterogeneity, as it is in Morocco between the left and Islamic movements. For its part, in addition to the repression that began since the emergence, since the gestation of the movement, the royal palace deploys various king reclaims the popular expectations of democratic change as it is analyzed by the youth, and this way he positions himself as the only actor able to gather the majority legitimacy. And regarding political parties, Benafla and Sneaver point out that they opt for permanent consensus with the rulers, which suppresses finally the political confliction at the institutional level. And in parallel to that, the rulers operate a strategy to discredit the activists. Moroccan media, which are mostly controlled by the regime, by the rulers, have completely misinformed the population about the process. For example, we have defamation of the founders and the activists, false articles about the intentions of the movement as well as the fate of the activists, and the lack of information during the mobilization and about the violent dispersals. So the media have adopted the reason of state by conveying the propaganda of transitional ideology. In fact, they cruise the public opinion on the only accessible political model to the royal palace, which is the one of the Moroccan Exhaustion. And this propaganda, which was also taken up by the international media, prevented the activists from an interaction with them and the media. And this made finally the process completely invisible to the population. For their part, several independent newspapers, they gave visibility to the movement, experienced, a judicial or economic repression, which left, again, the activists with no media action.
Hi, I'm going to be talking to you about the uprising in Bahrain, and specifically I'm going to be referring to kind of how the government has crafted the narrative of the uprising since, or sort of during the uprising and since, to effectively preserve its position of power. I'm going to be doing this by looking specifically at these books. I've got one volume with me actually. There are two, each of them is around 500 pages. They're huge, huge, huge books that purport to document effectively the first 40 days of the uprising. According to the work's publisher, it documents a time when the peace and harmony, the multi-ethnicity, inclusiveness, and openness that once symbolized the island nation of Bahrain were tested. Now, if that sounds just a little bit disingenuous to you as a characterization of Bahrain prior to the uprising, you're really not alone, and you're kind of getting at what, to me, is the core and the sort of most important part, or sort of the usefulness of this book, which is it is extremely dishonest in its characterization of the uprising. It aims to craft a narrative of the uprising where the regime's violent suppression of mostly peaceful protest is justified to a largely international audience. Just to touch on that very briefly, the book itself was launched at the 2012 Frankfurt Book Fair. The publishing company that publishes it is based in Bahrain, and the copy that I have myself came into my possession. It was it was one of two sets gifted to the University of Chicago by the delegation, or the ambassadorial delegation to Washington, D.C. The ambassador and several of his staff came to the University of Chicago, and they brought these books with them. So as you can kind of see, there's a very clear sort of international audience for these books, and specifically there's a, the audience is, I think, what you would call the global elite. It's policymakers, both current and future, academics, intellectuals, those types of people. Miracle Publishing is the organization which published the book, and just kind of to briefly touch on who they are, they're largely an advertising agency. They work in a variety of medias. They don't really formally identify themselves as being associated with the government or the regime in any particular way, but this is a snapshot of their client list from their own website. You can see the top right there, you've got the Ministry of the Interior listed as a client. You have the Ministry of Culture right below that. You have MENA Telecom, which is the national telecommunications company. There's one of the main banks there. I can't remember which one it is, but it's up there. So as you can quite clearly see, this company has a fairly vested interest in maintaining at least a certain degree of a positive relationship with the Bahraini government. be a basis for the analysis I'm going to perform in this presentation. Let's also just sort of talk briefly about why this is important, why these books are worth talking about. The Bahraini regime has maintained it, or it understands that its hold on power is largely dependent on its ability to stay in the good graces of its allies. The 40 days of initial uprising were ended with the GCC invasion, the Saudis and the UAE came in with their tanks and everything. And then, of course, also they rely very heavily on the material support of the United States and the United Kingdom. They understand as a result that if they are painted in a bad light abroad, that will end badly for them and will result in their loss of power. So they've worked very hard to control the narrative, and within this book, I think effectively we have a pretty accurate representation of kind of the length and breadth of that narrative. It's also worth sort of mentioning too that they've contracted with several very, very high-end public relations firms both in the United Kingdom and in the United States, and that type of really high-gloss sort of public relations campaign, the narrative and their propaganda really has that kind of sheen to it. So there are a couple of sort of points of analysis that I'm going to do, two main points. The first is it's sort of a comparison. There's a lot more that can be done, but for the sake of time, I've chosen two specific areas. The first is that there are very interestingly sort of contrasting portrayals of pro-regime supporters and anti-regime supporters in this book. And specifically, there's an interesting sort of difference in how the religious affiliation of those protesters is shown depending upon who they're supporting. And then the other point of analysis that I'm going to do is that on the one hand, there is a maximization of the damage and disorder caused by the protesters, and also a comparable then minimization of the sort of overuse of force that the regime employed throughout the entire uprising. This is all going to be, so the first bit is how are regime opponents depicted, just kind of some main points. I'm going to show you all these photos and we're going to talk about each of them, so it's not tremendously important to dwell too long on here, but I mean, just generally speaking, you've got kind of, I look at kind of at elements of visual composition in this because I do think that that's important for how people perceive the pictures. There's a frequent reiteration through the captions next to these photos of the fact that, the opposition protests were unauthorized, unlicensed, all of that. There's framing of the pictures to make the opposition protesters seem more so hardline and uncooperative, framing which kind of portrays the religiosity of the opposition in a way that I would argue is scary to the sort of Western audience of these books. And the kind of cumulative effect of all of these different things is that it makes it very difficult to empathize with a group of people who were, effectively